Officers who only infrequently saw General Friedrich Paulus, the commander of the Sixth Army, were unaware of any change in his state of mind. His bearing, the style of his orders, the smile with which he listened to both important reports and to trivial points of detail, all seemed to indicate that he was still in control of events. Only the two men closest to him, his adjutant, Colonel Adam, and his chief of staff, General Schmidt, realized how much he had changed since the beginning of the battle for Stalingrad. He could still be arrogant, condescending, or charmingly witty. He could still enter warmly and intimately into the lives of his officers. He still had the power to throw whole regiments and divisions into battle, to promote and demote his men, to sign orders for decorations. He still smoked his usual cigarettes. But deep down, something was changing, and this change was on the point of becoming irrevocable. General Paulus had lost the feeling of being in control of time and events. Until recently, he had only cast a quick, unworried glance over the reports furnished by his intelligence section. What did he care about the movements of the Russian reserves? What did their latest plans matter to him? Now, however, when he looked at the file of documents and reports placed on his desk every morning by Colonel Adam, the reports of Russian troop movements during the night were the first thing he studied. Colonel Adam had noticed this one day. He had changed the order of the file so that the intelligence reports were on the top. Paulus had opened the file and looked at the first page. He had then raised his eyebrows and slammed the file shut. Surprised by the rather pathetic look that had crossed Paulus's face, Colonel Adam realized he had been tactless. A few days later, Paulus had looked through the documents and reports, now once again in their usual order, and smiled. "You're evidently a very perceptive man, Herr Innovator." It was a quiet autumn evening. General Schmidt was on his way to report to Paulus. He was feeling triumphant. He walked down the silent, deserted street. In his head, beneath his heavy peaked cap, were the plans for the most ruthless offensive yet to be launched in Stalingrad. And that was how he described it when Paulus received him and asked him to sit down. "There have indeed, in German military history, been offensives for which we have mobilized far greater quantities of men and equipment, but I, for one, have never been asked to organize such a dense concentration of both air and ground forces in such a limited sector of the front." Paulus's attitude, as he listened to Schmidt, was not that of a commander-in-chief. His back was hunched, and as Schmidt's finger pointed to columns of figures and sectors marked on maps, his head turned quickly and obediently from side to side. Paulus himself had conceived this offensive. He had defined its parameters. But now, as he listened to Schmidt, the most brilliant chief of staff he had worked with, he felt unable to recognize his original conception. It was as though Schmidt was imposing his will on him, as though he had planned an offensive that went against his commanding officer's wishes. "Yes," said Paulus, "and this concentration of forces is all the more impressive when you compare it to the void on our left flank." "But what can we do about that?" said Schmidt. "Russia's so vast, we simply don't have enough men." "I'm not alone in feeling worried," said Paulus. "Von Weiss said to me, 'We didn't strike with a fist, we struck with an open hand, our fingers stretching across the infinite spaces of the East.' And others are worried too. In fact, there's only one man who isn't worried." He didn't finish the sentence. Everything was going as it should, and yet somehow failing to go as it should. It was as if the trifling uncertainties and chance misfortunes of the last weeks were beginning to reveal something quite new, the true face of war, the face of war in all its joylessness and hopelessness. The intelligence section obstinately continued to report a build-up of Soviet forces in the northwest. Air attacks seemed powerless to prevent this. Von Weiss had no German reserves to cover Paulus's flanks. He was attempting to mislead the Russians by installing German radio transmitters in zones occupied by Romanian troops. But this was enough, was it, to turn the Romanians into Germans? The campaign in Africa had begun triumphantly. Fierce punishment had been meted out to the English at Dunkirk, in Norway and Greece, and yet the British Isles remained unoccupied. There had been magnificent victories in the east. They had marched thousands of miles to the Volga. And yet the Soviet armed forces had still not been smashed once and for all. It always seemed that what mattered had already been achieved, that only chance, only some trivial delay had prevented a victory from being decisive. What did they matter, these few hundred meters that separated him from the Volga? These half-ruined factories, these burnt-out shells of buildings, compared to the vast spaces conquered during the summer offensive. But then only a few kilometers of desert had separated Rommel from his Egyptian oasis. And at Dunkirk there had been only a few kilometers, only a few hours, short of an absolute victory. It was always the same few kilometers. And there was always a lack of reserves, a gaping void in the rear of the victorious forces and at their flanks. Summer 1942? Probably only once in a lifetime is a man allowed to live through days like those. He had felt the breath of India on his face. He had felt what an avalanche would feel, if it had feelings, as it smashes through forests and forces rivers out of their beds. The idea had occurred to him that perhaps the German ear had grown accustomed to the name Friedrich. He had not really thought about this seriously, but still, it was just then that a little grain of very hard sand had grated under his foot, or rather, against his teeth. Headquarters had been full of a general sense of triumph and exultation. He was constantly receiving written reports, oral reports, radio reports, telephone reports, from the commanding officers of his different units. This hadn't seemed like work at all. It had been simply a symbolic expression of German triumph. And then one day the telephone had rung. "Herr Commander-in-Chief!" Somehow this matter-of-fact voice had immediately sounded out of harmony with the peals of triumph filling the ether. Vella, a divisional commander, had reported that in his sector the Russians had gone over to the offensive. An infantry detachment, equivalent in size to a reinforced battalion, had succeeded in breaking through to the railway station. It was with this seemingly insignificant incident that he had felt his first prickle of anxiety. Schmidt read the plan of operations out loud. As he did so, he straightened his shoulders and raised his chin. He wanted to indicate that in spite of the good personal relations between him and Paulus, he was aware of the formality of this meeting. Quite unexpectedly, Paulus came out with some words that Schmidt found strange and upsetting. In a quiet voice, not that of a commander-in-chief, no, not that of a soldier at all, he said, "I believe in victory, but you know what? There's something quite senseless and unnecessary about the whole struggle for this city." That comes a little unexpectedly from the commander-in-chief of the armies around Stalingrad. You think so? But Stalingrad no longer exists as a centre of communications or heavy industry. What do we want it for? We can cover the northeastern flank of our Caucasian armies along the line Astrakhan-Kalach. We don't need Stalingrad for that. I'm confident of victory, Schmidt. We shall capture the tractor factory, but that won't help us cover our flank. The Russians are going to attack. Von Weiss is quite sure none of our bluffing will stop that. The course of events changes their meaning, said Schmidt. But the Führer has never yet withdrawn without first attaining an objective. Paulus himself believed that if the most brilliant victories had failed to bear the expected fruits, this was because they hadn't been carried through with the necessary tenacity and decisiveness. At the same time, he felt that the ability to abandon an objective that had lost its meaning was a sign of strength. He looked into Schmidt's intelligent, piercing eyes. It's not for us to impose our will on the great strategist. He picked up the order of operations and signed it. 4 copies only, in view of its particular secrecy, said Schmidt. After his visit to Army headquarters, Derensky went to a unit deployed along the southeastern flank of the Stalingrad front, in the waterless sands around the Caspian Sea. The steppes with their small rivers and lakes now seemed like an earthly paradise. Feather grass grew there were horses, an occasional tree. Thousands of men, all of them used to morning dew, the rustle of hay, the humid air, had now taken up quarters in these sandy wastes. The sand cut their skin, got into their ears, found its way into their bread and gruel, grated in the mechanisms of their watches and the bolts of their rifles, penetrated their dreams. These were harsh conditions for a human body, for human throats and nostrils, for human calves and thighs. It was as though the human body were a cart that had left the road and was now creaking its way across rough ground. All day long, Derensky visited artillery positions, had discussions, jotted down notes, made sketches, inspected equipment and ammunition dumps. By evening, he was exhausted. His ears buzzed, and his legs, unaccustomed to these shifting sands, were aching and throbbing. Derensky had long ago noticed that during a retreat, generals become particularly sensitive to the needs of their subordinates, commanding officers, and members of the military Soviet suddenly reveal themselves to be modest, self-critical, and full of skepticism. Never does an army prove to be so full of intelligent, all-understanding men as during a forced retreat, when the general staff are searching for culprits. But here in the desert, people were simply apathetic and lethargic. It was as though the officers were convinced there was nothing for them to do, nothing for them to be concerned about. After all, these sands would be exactly the same tomorrow, the following day, in a year's time. The chief of staff of an artillery regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Bova, invited Derensky to stay the night with him. Bova was stoop-shouldered, bald, and hard of hearing in one ear. His quarters were a shack made from boards smeared with clay and manure. The floor was covered with ragged sheets of tarred roofing paper. The shack was identical in every detail to those where the other officers were quartered. "Greetings," said Bova, shaking Derensky energetically by the hand. "How's this, then?" he asked, gesturing at the walls. "It looks like I'll be spending the winter in a dog kennel smeared with shit." "I've seen worse lodgings," said Derensky, surprised at the transformation of the usually quiet Bova. Bova sat Derensky down on a crate that had once contained cans of food from America, poured out some vodka into a large dirty glass whose rim was smeared with dried toothpaste, and handed him a green pickled tomato on a piece of damp newspaper. "Make yourself at home, Comrade Lieutenant Colonel," he insisted. "We've got vodka and we've got fruit." Derensky, who seldom drank, took a small, cautious sip and pushed his glass away. He asked Bova about the state of his troops. Bova, however, didn't want to talk shop. "Yes, Comrade Lieutenant Colonel," he said, "I've had enough of work. In the old days I never took a moment off, not even when there were all those splendid women around in Kuban and the Ukraine. Heavens, and they weren't shy either, believe me. You only had to wink at them. But I just sat on my arse in the operations section. I didn't know what I'd missed till I was out here in the desert." At first, Derensky was annoyed by Bova's reluctance to discuss the average density of troops per square kilometre of front, or to give his opinion on the possible advantages of mortars over artillery in desert conditions. Nevertheless, he was not uninterested by the new turn of conversation that it had taken. "You can say that again," he exclaimed. There are some magnificent women in the Ukraine. There's one I used to visit in 1941 when we had our HQ in Kiev. She was a real beauty, the wife of someone in the public prosecutor's office. And I'm not going to argue about Kuban either. Yes, I rate Kuban very highly indeed. The number of beautiful women there is quite remarkable. Derensky's words had an extraordinary effect on Bova. He started to curse and then gave a cry of despair. And now we have to make do with Kalmyks. Wrong, said Derensky emphatically. He then became surprisingly eloquent about the charm of these swarthy and high-cheekboned women who smelt of wormwood and the smoke of the steppes. Remembering Alla Sergeyevna, he concluded, "You're wrong. There are women everywhere. There may be no water in the desert, but there are always women." Bova didn't respond. He was asleep. Only then did Derensky realize that his host was drunk. Bova's head was hanging off the edge of the camp bed, and his snores were like the groans of a dying man. Derensky, with the special tenderness and patience that a Russian feels towards a drunkard, placed a pillow under his head and some sheets of newspaper under his legs. He then wiped the saliva off Bova's lip and began looking round for somewhere to lie down himself. He laid his host's greatcoat on the floor, threw his own on top, put his knapsack down to serve as a pillow. When he was out on a mission, this knapsack served as his office, his food store, and as a container for his washing kit. He went outside, drank in the cold night air, and gasped as he gazed at the unearthly flames in the black Asiatic sky. He urinated, still looking at the stars, thought, Yes, the cosmos, and went back in. He lay down on his host's greatcoat and covered himself with his own. Then, instead of closing his eyes, he gazed pensively and gloomily into the darkness. What poverty he was surrounded by. Here he was, lying on the floor, looking at some leftover marinated tomatoes and a cardboard suitcase that no doubt contained only a skimpy towel with a black stamp on it, some crumpled collars for a soldier's tunic, an empty holster for a revolver, and a squashed soap box. The hut in Verkhny Pomgrony, where he had spent the night last autumn, now seemed luxurious. And in a year's time, perhaps, this present hut would seem equally luxurious. He'd look back on it longingly as he went to sleep at the bottom of some empty pit. Derensky had changed during his months on the artillery staff. His need for work, something that had once seemed as powerful as his need for food, was now satisfied. His work no longer gave him any particular satisfaction, any more than eating affords any particular satisfaction to someone well-fed. Derensky was highly regarded by his superior officers. At first, this had been a great joy to him. Over the years, he'd become all too used to the opposite. He was probably valued even more highly on the staff of the Stalingrad Front than Novikov had been during his time on the staff of the Southeastern Front. He had heard that whole pages of his reports were transcribed verbatim in reports addressed by important people in Moscow to still more important people. At a critical period, his intelligence and his work had been discovered to be of real use and importance. 5 years before the war, however, his wife had left him, considering him to be an enemy of the people who had succeeded in hiding from her the flabbiness and hypocrisy that was his true nature. He had often been turned down for jobs because of his background. He came from an aristocratic family, both on his mother's side and on his father's side. To begin with, he'd been upset to learn that someone particularly stupid or ignorant had been appointed instead of him, and then he'd begun to feel he really couldn't be trusted with a position of executive responsibility. His spell in camp had made him certain of his inadequacy. And now this terrible war had proved how far this was from the truth. Derensky pulled his coat up over his shoulders exposing his feet to the cold draught from the door. He wondered why it was that, at a time when his knowledge and abilities had finally been recognised, he should be lying on the floor, in a hen coop, listening to the piercing screams of camels, dreaming not of dachas and rest homes, but of a clean pair of pants and a decent piece of soap. He felt proud, and at the same time annoyed, that his promotion hadn't brought him any material advantage. His high opinion of himself went hand in hand with a persistent feeling of timidity. Deep down, he felt he wasn't entitled to the good things of life. This constant lack of both self-assurance and money, this constant sense of being badly dressed, was something he'd been used to since childhood, something that still hadn't left him. He was terrified at the thought of going into the military Soviet canteen and being told by the girl behind the counter, "Lieutenant Colonel, comrade, I'm afraid you're only entitled to eat in the general canteen." Then some witty general would say at a meeting, "Well, Lieutenant Colonel, did you enjoy the borscht in the military Soviet canteen?" He'd always been amazed at the brazenness with which not only generals, but even mere photographers would eat and drink, or demand petrol, clothes and cigarettes, in places where they had no right even to visit. His father had been unable to find work for years on end. His mother, a stenographer, had been the breadwinner. Around midnight, Bova stopped snoring. Terensky felt worried by the sudden silence. Suddenly Bova asked, "Are you still awake, comrade Lieutenant Colonel?" "Yes, I can't get to sleep." "Forgive me for not making you more comfortable," said Bova. "I'd had a little too much to drink, but now I feel as clear-headed as ever, and what I keep asking myself is this: what on earth did we do to end up in this godforsaken hole? Whose fault is it?" "The Germans, of course," said Terensky. "You lie on the bed," said Bova. "I can go on the floor myself." "What do you mean? I'm fine as I am." "It's not right. In the Caucasus, it's not done for a host to stay in his bed while a guest sleeps on the floor." "Never mind, we're hardly Caucasians." "We're not far off it. The foothills are very close. You say the Germans are responsible? But maybe we did our bit too." Bova must have sat up. His bed gave a loud squeak. "Yes," he said, drawing the word out thoughtfully. "Yes," said Terensky non-committally. Bova had directed the conversation into an unusual channel. They were silent for a moment, each wondering whether he should continue such a conversation with someone he hardly knew. In the end, it appeared that they had both decided against it. Bova lit a cigarette. Terensky glimpsed his face in the light of the match. It looked somehow flabby, sullen, alien. He lit a cigarette himself. Bova glimpsed his face as he lay there, resting his head on one elbow. His face looked cold, unkind, alien. Then they went on with the conversation. "Yes," said Bova. This time he spoke the word more sharply and decisively. "Bureaucrats and bureaucracy, that's what's landed us in this wilderness." "Yes," agreed Terensky. "Bureaucracy's terrible. My chauffeur said that in his village before the war you couldn't even get a document out of someone without giving them half a litre of vodka." "It's no laughing matter," Bova interrupted. "In peacetime bureaucracy can be bad enough, but on the front line... I heard a story about a pilot whose plane caught fire after a scrap with a Messerschmitt. Well, he parachuted out, was quite unscathed, but his trousers were burnt. And do you know what? They wouldn't give him a new pair. The quartermasters just said, 'No, you're not due yet for a new issue.' And that was that. 3 days he had to do without trousers. Finally, the commanding officer found out." "Excuse me," said Terensky, "but you can hardly make out that we've retreated from Brest to the Caspian desert simply because of some idiot refusing to issue a new pair of trousers." I never said it was because of the trousers," said Bova sourly. "Let me give you another example. There was an infantry detachment that had been surrounded. The men had nothing to eat. A squadron was ordered to drop them some food by parachute. And then the quartermaster refused to issue the food. He said he needed a signature on the delivery slip. And how could the men down below sign for what had been dropped by parachute? And he wouldn't budge. Finally, he received an order from above. Kerensky smiled. All right, that's very comic, but it's hardly of major importance. Just pedantry. Bureaucracy can be much more terrifying than that. Remember the order, not one step back? There was one place where the Germans were mowing our men down by the hundred. All we needed to do was to withdraw over the brow of the hill. Strategically, it would have made no difference, and we'd have saved our men and equipment, but the orders were not one step back. And so the men perished, and their equipment was destroyed. Yes, said Bova. You're right there. In 1941 we had 2 colonels sent out to us from Moscow to check on the execution of that very order. They didn't have any transport themselves, and during 3 days we retreated 200 kilometres from Gomel. If I hadn't taken them in my truck, they'd have been captured by the Germans in no time. And there they were, being shaken about in the back like a sack of potatoes, and asking what measures we'd taken to implement the order not one step back. And what else could they do? They couldn't not write their report. Kerensky took a deep breath, as though preparing to plunge still deeper. I'll tell you when bureaucracy really is terrible. It's when a lone machine gunner has defended a height against 70 Germans, when he's held up the enemy's advance all on his own, when a whole army's bowed down before him after his death, and then his tubercular wife is abused by an official from the district soviet and thrown out of her flat. It's when a man has to fill in 24 questionnaires and then ends up confessing at a meeting, "Comrades, I'm not one of you, I'm an alien element." It's when a man has to say, "Yes, this is a workers' and peasants' state. My mother and father were aristocrats, parasites, degenerates. Go on, throw me out onto the street." I don't see that as bureaucracy, said Bova. The state does belong to the workers and peasants. They're in control. What's wrong with that? That's as it should be. You wouldn't expect a bourgeois state to trust down-and-outs. Kerensky was taken aback. The man he was speaking to evidently thought very differently to himself. Bova lit a match. Instead of lighting a cigarette, he just held it up towards Kerensky. Kerensky screwed up his eyes. He felt like a soldier caught in the beam of an enemy searchlight. "I'm from the purest of working-class backgrounds myself," Bova went on. "My father was a worker, and so was my grandfather. My background's as pure as crystal, but I was no use to anyone before the war either." "Why not?" "I don't look on it as bureaucracy. If a workers' and peasant state treats aristocrats with suspicion. But why did they go for my throat? I thought I was going to end up picking potatoes or sweeping the streets, and all I'd done was criticise the bosses from a class viewpoint. I'd said they were living in the lap of luxury. Well, I really caught it then. That's what I see as the root of bureaucracy, a worker suffering in his own state." Kerensky had the feeling that Bova had touched on something of great importance. He felt a sudden happiness. He was unaccustomed either to talking about his own deepest preoccupations or to hearing other people talk about theirs. To do this, to speak one's mind freely and without fear, to argue uninhibitedly and without fear, seemed a great joy. Everything felt different here. As he lay on the floor of this shack, talking to a simple soldier who had only just sobered up, sensing the invisible presence of thousands of men who had retreated from the western Ukraine to this wilderness, Kerensky knew that something had changed, something very simple and natural, something very necessary, and at the same time quite impossible, quite unthinkable, had come about. He and another man had talked freely and sincerely. "Yes," said Kerensky, "but you've got one thing wrong. The bourgeoisie don't allow down-and-outs into the Senate, that's for sure. But if a down-and-out becomes a millionaire, then it's another story. The Fords started out as ordinary workers. We don't trust members of the bourgeoisie and aristocracy with positions of responsibility, and that's fair enough. but it's another matter altogether to stamp the mark of Cain on the forehead of an honest worker simply because his mother and father were kulaks or priests. That's not what I call a class viewpoint. Anyway, do you think I didn't meet workers from the Putilov factory or miners from Donetsk during my time in camp? They were there in their thousands. What's really terrifying is when you realize that bureaucracy isn't simply a growth on the body of the state. If it were only that, it could be cut off. No, bureaucracy is the very essence of the state. And in wartime, people don't want to die just for the sake of the head of some personnel department. Any flunky can stamp refused on some petition. Any flunky can kick some soldier's widow out of his office. But to kick out the Germans, you have to be strong. You have to be a man. That's for sure, said Bova. But don't think I feel any resentment, said Dorinsky. No, I bow down and take off my hat. I'm happy. 1,000 thank yous. What's wrong is that we had to undergo such terrible tragedies before I could be happy, before I was allowed to devote my energies to my country. If that's the price of my happiness, I'd rather be without it. Dorinsky felt that he still hadn't dug down to what really mattered, that he still hadn't been able to find the simple words that would cast a new, clear light on their lives. But he was happy to have thought and talked about what he'd only very seldom thought or talked about. Let me say one thing. I can tell you that whatever happens, I shall never ever regret this conversation of ours. Mikhail Mostovskoy was kept for over 3 weeks in the isolation ward. He was fed well, examined twice by an SS doctor and prescribed injections of glucose. During his first hours of confinement, Mostovskoy expected to be summoned for interrogation at any moment. He felt constantly irritated with himself. Why had he talked with Ikonikov? That holy fool had betrayed him, planting compromising papers on him just before a search. The days passed, and Mostovskoy still wasn't summoned. He went over the conversations he had had with the other prisoners about politics, wondering which of them he could recruit. At night, when he couldn't sleep, he composed a text for some leaflets and began compiling a camp phrasebook to facilitate communication between different nationalities. He remembered the old laws of conspiracy, intended to exclude the possibility of a total debacle if an agent provocateur should denounce them. Mostovskoy wanted to question Yershov and Osipov about the immediate aims of the organization. He was confident that he'd be able to overcome Osipov's prejudice against Yershov. Chernetsov, who hated Bolshevism and yet longed for the victory of the Red Army, seemed a pathetic figure. Now Mostovskoy felt quite calm about the prospect of his impending interrogation. One night, Mostovskoy had a heart attack. He lay there with his head against the wall, feeling the agony of a man left to die in prison. For a while the pain made him lose consciousness. Then he came to. The pain had lessened, but his chest, his face, and the palms of his hands were all covered in sweat. His thoughts took on a deceptive clarity. His conversation about evil with the Italian priest became confused with a number of different memories, with the happiness he'd felt as a boy when it had suddenly begun to pour with rain, and he had rushed into the room where his mother was sewing, with his wife's bright eyes wet with tears when she had come to visit him at the time he was in exile by the Yenisei, with pale Zazinski, whom he had once asked at a party conference about the fate of a young and very kind social revolutionary. Shot, Zazinski had answered. Major Kirillov's gloomy eyes. Draped in a sheet, the corpse of his friend was being dragged along on a sledge. He had refused to accept his offer of help during the siege of Leningrad. A boy's dreamy head and its mop of hair. And now this large, bald skull pressed against the rough boards. These distant memories drifted away. Everything became flatter and lost its colour. He seemed to be sinking into cold water. He fell asleep, to wake to the howl of sirens in the early morning gloom. In the afternoon he was taken to the sick bay bath. He sighed as he examined his arms and his hollowed chest. Yes, old age is here to stay, he thought to himself. The guard, who was rolling a cigarette between his fingers, went out for a moment, and the narrow-shouldered, pockmarked prisoner who had been mopping the cement floor sidled over to Mostovskoy. Yershov ordered me to tell you the news. The German offensive in Stalingrad has been beaten off. The major told me to tell you that everything is in order, and he wants you to write a leaflet. Pass it on when you have your next bath. Mostovskoy wanted to say that he didn't have a pencil and paper, but just then the guard came in. As he was getting dressed, Mostovskoy felt a small parcel in his pocket. It contained 10 sugar lumps, some bacon fat wrapped up in a piece of rag, some white paper and a pencil stub. He felt a sudden happiness. What more could he want? How fortunate he was not to have his life drawing to an end in trivial anxieties about indigestion, heart attacks, and sclerosis. He clasped the sugar lumps and the pencil to his breast. That night he was taken out of the sick bay by an SS sergeant. Gusts of cold wind blew into his face. He looked round at the sleeping barracks and said to himself, "Don't worry, lads. You can sleep in peace. Comrade Mostovskoy's got strong nerves. He won't give in." They went through the doors of the administration building. Here, instead of the stench of ammonia, was a cool smell of tobacco. Mostovskoy noticed a half-smoked cigarette on the floor and wanted to pick it up. They climbed up to the second floor. The guard ordered Mostovskoy to wipe his boots on the mat and did so himself at great length. Mostovskoy was out of breath from climbing the stairs. He tried to control his breathing. They set off down a strip of carpet that ran down the corridor. The lamps, small, semi-transparent tulips, gave a warm, calm light. They walked past a polished door with a small board saying "Kommandant" and stopped in front of another door with a board saying "Obersturmbannführer Liss." Mostovskoy had heard the name Liss many times. He was Himmler's representative in the camp administration. Mostovskoy was amused. General Goods had been annoyed that he had only been interrogated by one of Liss's assistants, while Osipov had been interrogated by Liss himself. Goods had seen this as a slight to the military command. Osipov had said that Liss had interrogated him without an interpreter. He was a German from Riga with a good knowledge of Russian. A young officer came out, said a few words to the guard, and let Mostovskoy into the office. He left the door open. The office was almost empty. The floor was carpeted. There was a vase of flowers on the table and a picture on the wall, peasant houses by the edge of a forest with red-tiled roofs. Mostovskoy thought it was like being in the office of the director of a slaughterhouse. Not far away were dying animals, steaming entrails, and people being spattered with blood, but the office itself was peaceful and softly carpeted. Only the black telephone on the desk served to remind you of the world outside. Enemy. That word was so clear and simple. Once again he thought of Chernetsov. What a wretched fate during this time of storm and drang. But then he did wear kid gloves. Mostovskoy glanced at his own hands, his own fingers. The door opened at the far end of the office. There was a creak from the door into the corridor. The orderly must have shut it as he saw Liss come in. Mostovskoy stood there and frowned. "Good evening," said the quiet voice of a short man with SS insignia on the sleeves of his grey uniform. There was nothing repulsive about Liss's face, and for that very reason Mostovskoy found it terrible to look at. He had a snub nose, alert dark grey eyes, a high forehead, and thin pale cheeks that made him look industrious and ascetic. Liss waited while Mostovskoy cleared his throat and then said, "I want to talk to you." "But I don't want to talk to you," answered Mostovskoy. He looked sideways into the far corner, waiting for Liss's assistant, the torturers, to emerge and give him a blow to the ear. "I quite understand," said Liss. "Sit down." He seated Mostovskoy in the armchair and then sat down next to him. Liss spoke in the lifeless, ash-cold language of a popular scientific pamphlet. "Are you feeling unwell?" Mostovskoy shrugged his shoulders and said nothing. Yes, I know. I sent the doctor to you and he told me, I've disturbed you in the middle of the night, but I want to talk to you very badly." "Oh yes," thought Mostovskoy. "I've been summoned for interrogation," he said out loud. "There's nothing for us to talk about." "Why do you say that?" asked Liss. "All you see is my uniform, but I wasn't born in it. The Führer and the party command. The rank and file obey. I was always a theoretician. I'm a party member, but my real interest lies in questions of history and philosophy. Surely not all the officers in your NKVD love the Lubyanka." Mostovskoy watched Liss's face carefully. He thought for a moment that this pale face with the high forehead should be drawn at the very bottom of the tree of evolution. From there, evolution would progress towards hairy Neanderthal man. "If the Central Committee orders you to step up the work of the Cheka, are you in a position to refuse? You put Hegel aside and get working. Well, we've had to put Hegel aside too." Mostovskoy glanced at Liss. Pronounced by unclean lips, the name of Hegel sounded strange and blasphemous. A dangerous, experienced thief had come up to him in a crowded tram and started a conversation. He wasn't going to listen. He was just going to watch the thief's hands. Any minute now a razor might flash out and slash him across the eyes. But Liss just lifted up the palms of his hands, looked at them and said, "Our hands are like yours. They love great work, and they're not afraid of dirt." Mostovskoy frowned deeply. It was horrible to see this gesture and hear these words that so exactly mimicked his own. Liss began to speak quickly and with enthusiasm, as though he had talked to Mostovskoy before and was glad to have the opportunity to resume the conversation. The things he said were extraordinary, terrible and absurd. "When we look one another in the face, we're neither of us just looking at a face we hate. No, we're gazing into a mirror. That's the tragedy of our age. Do you really not recognize yourselves in us, yourselves, and the strength of your will? Isn't it true that for you too the world is your will? Is there anything that can make you waver?" His face moved closer to Mostovskoy's. "Do you understand me? I don't know Russian well, but I very much want you to understand me. You may think you hate us, but what you really hate is yourselves. Yourselves in us. It's terrible, isn't it? Do you understand me?" Mostovskoy decided to remain silent. He mustn't let Liss draw him into conversation. But he did think for a moment that, rather than trying to deceive him, the man looking into his eyes was searching for words quite earnestly and sincerely. It was as though he were complaining, asking Mostovskoy to help him make sense of something that tormented him. It was agonizing. It was as though someone had stuck a needle into Mostovskoy's heart. "Do you understand me?" Liss repeated, already too excited even to see Mostovskoy. "When we strike a blow against your army, it's ourselves that we hit. Our tanks didn't only break through your defences, they broke through our own defences at the same time. The tracks of our tanks are crushing German National Socialism. It's terrible. It's like committing suicide in one's sleep. And it might well end tragically for us. Do you understand? Yes, even if we win. As victors, we would be left on our own, without you, in a world that is alien to us, a world that hates us." It would have been easy enough to refute all this. Liss's eyes had now drawn still closer to Mostovskoy's. But there was something even more dangerous than the words of this experienced SS provocateur. It was what stirred in Mostovskoy's own soul, his own vile, filthy doubts. He was like a man afraid of an illness, of some malignant tumour, who won't go near a doctor, tries not to notice his indispositions, and avoids talking about sickness with anyone close to him, and then suddenly someone comes up to him and says, "Say, have you ever had such and such a pain, especially in the mornings, usually after—" "Yes, yes." "Do you understand me, teacher?" asked Lys. "A certain German, I'm sure you know his brilliant work, once said that Napoleon's tragedy was that he embodied the soul of England, and yet in England herself found his most deadly foe." If only they'd start beating me up, thought Mostovskoy, and then, now he's on about Spengler. Lys lit a cigarette and held out his cigarette case to Mostovskoy. "No," said Mostovskoy abruptly. He felt somehow calmed by the thought that all the policemen in the world, the ones who'd interrogated him 40 years ago, and the one talking about Hegel and Spengler right now, should use this same idiotic technique of offering their victim a cigarette. Yes, it was just that his nerves were weak. He had been expecting to be beaten up, and suddenly he'd had to listen to this horrible, absurd talk. But even then, some of the Tsarist police had known a little about politics. A few of them were really quite educated. One had even read Das Kapital. But had there ever been a moment when a policeman studying Marx had wondered deep in his heart, what if Marx is right? What had the policeman felt then? But what of it? Mostovskoy had trampled on his doubts too. Still, that was different. He was a revolutionary. Not noticing that Mostovskoy had refused the cigarette, Lys muttered, "Yes, that's right. It's very good tobacco." He then closed his cigarette case and began again. He sounded genuinely upset. "Why do you find this conversation so surprising? What did you expect me to say? Surely you have some educated men at your Lubyanka? People who can talk to academician Pavlov or to Oldenburg? But I'm different from them. I've got no ulterior motive. I give you my word. I'm tormented by the same anxieties as you are." He smiled and added, "My word of honour as a Gestapo officer, and I don't say that lightly." "Don't say anything," Mostovskoy repeated to himself. "That's the main thing. Don't enter into conversation. Don't argue." Lys went on talking. Once again he seemed to have forgotten about Mostovskoy. "Two poles of one magnet, of course. If that wasn't the case, then this terrible war wouldn't be happening. We're your deadly enemies. Yes, yes, but our victory will be your victory. Do you understand? And if you should conquer, then we shall perish, only to live in your victory. It's paradoxical. Through losing the war, we shall win the war, and continue our development in a different form." Why on earth had this all-powerful Lys, instead of watching prize-winning films, drinking vodka, writing reports to Himmler, looking at books on gardening, rereading his daughter's letters, having fun with young girls from today's transport, or even just taking something for his digestion and going to sleep in his spacious bedroom, why on earth had he decided to summon an old Russian Bolshevik who stank of the camps? What did he have in mind? Why was he keeping his motives so secret? What was the information he wanted? Mostovskoy wasn't afraid of torture. What did terrify him was the thought, what if the German isn't lying? What if he's sincere? What if he really does just want someone to talk to? What a horrible thought. They were both ill, both worn out by the same illness, but one of them hadn't been able to bear it and was speaking out, while the other remained silent, giving nothing away, but listening. Finally, as though answering Mostovskoy's silent question, Lys opened a file on his desk and very fastidiously, with 2 fingers, took out some sheets of dirty papers. Mostovskoy immediately recognized them as Ikonnikov's scribblings. Lys evidently expected him to feel consternation at the sight of the papers planted on him by Ikonnikov, but he felt quite calm. He even felt glad to see these scribblings. Once again, everything was clear, as absurdly simple as every police interrogation. Lys pushed the papers to the edge of the desk, and then drew them back again. Suddenly he began to speak in German. "I've never seen your handwriting, but I knew from the first words that you could never have written rubbish like this." Mostovskoy remained silent. Lys tapped his finger against the papers. He was inviting Mostovskoy to speak, affably, insistently, with goodwill. Mostovskoy remained silent. "Have I made a mistake?" asked Lys in surprise. "No, it's not possible. You and I can feel only disgust at what's written here. We two stand shoulder to shoulder against trash like this." "Come on now," said Mostovskoy hurriedly and angrily. "Let's get to the point. These papers, yes, they were taken from me. You want to know who gave them to me? That's none of your business. Maybe I wrote them myself. Maybe you ordered someone to plant them on me. All right?" For a moment he thought Lys would accept his challenge, lose his temper, and shout, "We have ways of making you answer!" He would have liked that so much. That would make everything so straightforward, so easy. What a clear, simple word it was, enemy. But Lys only said, "Who cares about these wretched papers? What does it matter who wrote them? I know it was neither of us. Just think for a moment. Who do you imagine fill our camps when there's no war and no prisoners of war? Enemies of the party? Enemies of the people? Yes, and if our Reich Security Administration accepts prisoners of yours in peacetime, then we won't let them out again. Your prisoners are our prisoners." He grinned. "The German communists we've sent to camps are the same ones you sent to camps in 1937. Yezhov imprisoned them. Reichsfuhrer Himmler imprisoned them. Be more of a Hegelian teacher." He winked at Mostovskoy. "I've often thought that a knowledge of foreign languages must be as useful in your camps as it is in ours. Today you're appalled by our hatred of the Jews. Tomorrow you may make use of our experience yourselves. And by the day after tomorrow, we may be more tolerant again. I've been led by a great man down a long road. You too have been led by a great man. You too have travelled a long, difficult road. Do you really believe Bukharin was an agent provocateur? Only a very great man could lead people down a road like that. I knew Röhm myself. I trusted him, and that's how it had to be. What tortures me, though, is the thought that your terror killed millions. And we Germans were the only ones who could understand, the only men in the world who thought, yes, that's absolutely right, that's how it has to be. Please try to understand me as I understand you. This war ought to appall you. Napoleon should never have fought against England." Mostovskoy was struck by a new thought. He even screwed up his eyes, either because of a sudden stab of pain or to get rid of this tormenting thought. What if his doubts were not just a sign of weakness, tiredness, impotence, lack of faith, contemptible shilly-shallying? What if these doubts represented what was most pure and honourable in him? And he just crushed them, pushed them aside, hated them. What if they contained the seed of revolutionary truth, the dynamite of freedom? All he needed to do to defeat Lys, to push aside this sticky, slippery fingers, was to stop hating Chernetsov, stop despising that holy fool Ikonikov. No, he had to do more than that. He had to renounce everything he had stood for. He had to condemn what he had always lived by. No, he had to do more than that. With all the strength of his soul, with all his revolutionary passion, he'd have to hate the camps, the Lubyanka, bloodstained Yezhov, Yagoda, Beraya. More than that, he'd have to hate Stalin and his dictatorship. More than that, he'd have to condemn Lenin. This was the edge of the abyss. Yes, this was Lys's victory, not in the war running its course on the battlefields, but in the war of snake venom, the war without gunfire he was waging against him in his office. For a moment Mostovskoy thought he was about to go mad. Then he let out a sudden joyful sigh of relief. The thought that had horrified and blinded him had turned into dust. It was absurd and pathetic. The hallucination had lasted only a few seconds, but still, how was it that for even a second, a fraction of a second, he could have doubted the justice of a great cause? Liss looked at him and pursed his lips. "Do you think the world looks on us with horror, and on you with hope and love?" he asked. "No, the world looks on us both with the same horror." Mostovskoy was no longer afraid of anything. Now he knew where his doubts led. They didn't lead into a swamp, they led to the abyss. Liss picked up Ikonnikov's papers. "How could you have anything to do with people like this? Everything's been turned upside down by this accursed war. If only I could unravel this tangle." "There's no tangle, Herr Liss. Everything's very simple and very clear. We don't need to ally ourselves with Chernetsov and Ikonnikov to overpower you. We can deal with both them and you." Mostovskoy realized that everything dark and sinister was embodied in Liss. All rubbish heaps smelt the same. There was no difference between one lot of splintered wood and crushed brick and another. One shouldn't look to garbage and debris in order to understand similarities and differences. One should look to the thoughts, the design of the builder. Mostovskoy found himself gripped by a joyful, triumphant rage against Liss and Hitler, against the English officer with the colourless eyes who'd asked him about criticisms of Marxism, against the sickening speeches of the one-eyed Menshevik, against the mawkish preacher who had turned out to be a police agent. Where would these men ever find people stupid enough to believe that there was the faintest shadow of resemblance between a socialist state and the fascist Reich? The Gestapo officer Liss was the only consumer of their rotten goods. Now, as never before, Mostovskoy understood the inner link between fascism and its agents. And wasn't this the true genius of Stalin? He had hated and annihilated these people because he alone had seen the hidden brotherhood between fascism and the Pharisees who advocated a species freedom. This thought now seemed so obvious that he wanted to explain it, to bring home to Liss the full absurdity of his theories. But he contented himself with a smile. He'd been around a long time. He wasn't like that fool Goldenberg who'd blathered to the public prosecutor about the affairs of people's will. He stared straight at Liss. And then, in a voice that could probably be heard by the guard on the other side of the door, he said, "The best advice I can offer you is to stop wasting your time on me. You can stand me against the wall, you can hang me, you can do me in however you like." "No one here wishes to do you in," Liss answered hurriedly. "Please calm down." "I'm quite calm," said Mostovskoy brightly. "I've got nothing to worry about." "But you do have something to worry about. You should share my sleeplessness. What is the reason for our enmity? I can't understand. Is it that the Führer is a mere lackey of Stinnes and Krupp? That there's no private property in your country? That your banks and factories belong to the people? That you're internationalists and we're preachers of racial hatred? That we set things on fire and you extinguish the flames? That the world hates us and that its hopes are centered on Stalingrad? Is that what you people say?" "Nonsense, there's no divide. It's just been dreamed up. In essence, we are the same, both one-party states. Our capitalists are not the masters. The state gives them their plan. The state takes their profit and all they produce. As their salary, they keep 6% of the profit. Your state also outlines a plan and takes what is produced for itself. And the people you call masters, the workers, also receive a salary from your one-party state." Mostovskoy watched Liss and thought to himself, "Did this vile nonsense really confuse me for a moment? Was I really choking in this stream of poisonous, stinking dirt?" Liss gave a despairing wave of the hand. "The red workers' flag flies over our people's state too. We too call people to national achievement, to unity and labour. We say the party expresses the dream of the German worker. You say nationalism, labour. You know as well as we do that nationalism is the most powerful force of our century. Nationalism is the soul of our epoch, and socialism in one country is the supreme expression of nationalism. I don't see any reason for our enmity, but the teacher of genius, the leader of the German people, our father, the best friend of all German mothers, the brilliant and wise strategist, began this war, and I believe in Hitler, and I know that Stalin's mind is in no way clouded by pain or anger. Through all the fire and smoke of war, he can see the truth. He knows his true enemy. Yes, even now when he discusses joint military strategy with him and drinks to his health, there are two great revolutionaries in the world, Stalin and our leader. It is their will that gave birth to state national socialism. Brotherhood with you is more important to me than territory in the East. We are two houses that should stand side by side. Now, teacher, I want you to live for a while in quiet solitude. I want you to think before our next conversation. What for? It's all just nonsense. It's absurd and senseless, said Mostovskoy. And why call me teacher in that idiotic way? There's nothing idiotic about it, replied Lys. You and I both know that it's not on battlefields that the future is decided. You knew Lenin personally. He created a new type of party. He was the first to understand that only the party and its leader can express the spirit of the nation. He did away with the Constituent Assembly. But just as Maxwell destroyed Newton's system of mechanics while thinking he had confirmed it, so Lenin considered himself a builder of internationalism, while in actual fact he was creating the great nationalism of the 20th century. And we learnt many things from Stalin. To build socialism in one country, one must destroy the peasants' freedom to sow what they like and sell what they like. Stalin didn't shilly-shally, he liquidated millions of peasants. Hitler saw that the Jews were the enemy, hindering the German National Socialist movement, and he liquidated millions of Jews. But Hitler's no mere student. He's a genius in his own right, and he's not one to be squeamish either. It was the Röhm Purge that gave Stalin the idea for the purge of the party in 1937. You must believe me. You've kept silent while I've been talking, but I know that I'm like a mirror for you, a surgical mirror. A mirror? Said Mostovskoy. Every word you've said from beginning to end is a lie. It's beneath me to refute your filthy, stinking, provocative blathering. A mirror? You must be crazy. But Stalingrad will bring you back to your senses. Lys stood up. In painful confusion, feeling both hatred and ecstasy, Mostovskoy thought, now he's going to shoot me, that's it. But Lys seemed not to have heard Mostovskoy. He bowed from the waist. Teacher, he said, you will continue to teach us and continue to learn from us. We shall think together. Lys's face was sad and serious, but his eyes were laughing. Once again the poisoned needle entered Mostovskoy's heart. Lys looked at his watch and said, well, time will tell. He rang a bell and said quietly, you can have this back if you want it. We shall meet again soon. Gute Nacht. Without knowing why, Mostovskoy picked the papers up and thrust them into his pocket. He was led out of the administration building and back out into the cold night. Cold damp air, the howl of sirens in the gloom before dawn, how pleasant it all was after the Gestapo office and the quiet voice of the National Socialist theoretician. A car with violet headlamps passed them as they reached the sick bay. Mostovskoy realized that Lys was on his way home. Once again he was seized by a deep melancholy. The guard took him to his cubicle and locked the door. He sat down on the boards and thought, if I believed in God, I would think that terrible interrogator had been sent to me as a punishment for my sins. A new day was already beginning, and he was unable to sleep. Leaning back against the rough, splintering planks of pine that had been knocked together into a wall, Mostovskoy began to peruse Ikonakov's scribblings.